Welcome to the Libido Lounge, where we focus on all things love, lust, and libido. We believe that fabulous sex is important to health as exercise and good food. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode on the lounge. We're talking about polarity play today, and polarity play is a very important topic, whether you're in a long-term committed relationship, whether you're just dating, or whether you're single. We can learn so much about this topic. And polarity play is really based upon, in many ways, laws of attraction, as well as embodying the different parts of ourselves. So, what do I mean by this? So, I'll take a step back and say that a lot of my study with this actually came through one of my doctorate degrees, which is in acupuncture and oriental medicine. And so much of the foundational root, say, understanding of medicine from that philosophy is really looking at poles, is looking at opposites. It's looking at these opposite forces inside of us. And in studying sexuality out of certain Eastern traditions and Eastern texts from a medical perspective, what's very interesting is this concept of these poles, these forces, has actually been around for a really, really, really long time, centuries and centuries and centuries. So, from a sexual perspective, what we're really looking at with polarity is that all of us inside of us have these forces. We can call this one force the force of fire or more of movement. We can call another force inside of us almost this force of water, of structure, of storage, of receiving. So we have the mover and we have the receiver, and we can label these as such. So we're constantly in this world of really internally having a moving force and a receiving force. And a non-sexual example of this, just so you kind of understand the concepts of this, and then we're going to get more into the sexual ways that this plays out in our relationships, in our intimate moments, how to use this to more deeply connect to your partner. But one of the things we see, one of like a real life example, is simply in looking at nature. We have that moving force, right? We have that moving force during the day. The sun's out, you're being productive, you're out in the world. We have that receptive force at night. You're restoring, you're healing, you're going internal, you're resting, you're making more energy, you're detoxing, you're doing all these things at night when you rest and when you sleep. So we see that like just in the natural versions of our circadian rhythm. And when we look at some of the ancient studies of polarities, we're really looking at these two forces are always in us at any given time. Anybody who's seen that classic Taiji, that yin yang, white black symbol, that's part of what this is representing, is these opposing forces that are actually always in us at any given time. So in sexual experiences, what we tend to see happen is there's this almost magnetic attraction when people are embodying different parts of the poles, right? So we see that magnets are a great example, right? We see this opposites attract. We see these opposite forces are actually drawn together, those poles, that positive, that negative, right? So we see this in the way that electricity works. We see this in the way that magnets work. We see all of this needing to work with the poles in various ways. And so in any sort of sexual relationship, what tends to work very well is when there is almost this like fiery, say, force, this giver, this say energetic giver, and the receiver, right? And so this plays out in the bedroom. And this can be very, very simple the way this plays out. For example, this plays out when one partner is on top. That partner is more of the giver most of the time than that partner on the bottom. But the idea of polarity in the play in the bedroom and outside of the bedroom with foreplay, with the way we talk to each other, is really about embodying different roles. Now, in a classic hetero cisgender type of relationship, what tends to happen is that the masculine role oftentimes has more of that force, that movement force, that really fiery force, versus the female in that type of relationship has more of that receptive type of receiving the energy, of actually taking that energy in. And we can play with those poles, right? The masculine going deeper into that kind of almost more like slightly dominating in the bedroom. Doesn't have to be, but can be, but more slightly in that role, and the female being the opposite. But a way of actually bringing more novelty in this is basically sometimes switching up these roles in say the play of the bedroom. So this can be done in all sorts of different ways, but perhaps the female becomes more of the, and whoever's the giver, oftentimes it is the female, but whoever is the more of the, say, the receiver in that classic scenario, perhaps that person all of a sudden becomes more of that yang, that fire, that giver, that force, right? So you can start to role play. So one way of working with these concepts is to really identify, okay, do you tend to be that force of the person that initiates more, right? The person that perhaps is on top more, that person that is perhaps in control of the positions more, the person that perhaps is like grabbing and controlling more of any sort of thrusting, any sorts of that. Are you the person that initiates more of any sort of foreplay, any of those kinds of things? And you can start with this by identifying what are the common roles from a polarity perspective. What are the common roles that you tend to fall into? Are you more of that receptive role, that person that is maybe a little bit more passive with initiating, that person that is really receiving, that person that is not going to maybe climb on top as much, that person that is not going to initiate as many of the positions, that person that is really just receiving the energy instead of actively putting out that energy, right? And neither one of these positions are good or bad, right? That's the nature of these poles. In fact, what we see in some of the ancient texts is like having these types of poles actually is like this attraction, right? These different forces, but we all have these forces inside of us. And even if in the way you show up in your life, both in the world as well as in the way you show up in your sexual intimacy, even if you have a tendency to be one of these poles, when you start actually working with this and realizing your tendency, the conversation you can begin to have is, what happens if you flip your poles? Right? And so if you're in a partnership, you can actually flip your poles by saying, if you're more of that, like that force, that giver, that like accelerator, what happens if you actually take a receptive role, and vice versa? So all of a sudden, if you are more the receiver, the one that's maybe a little bit more passive, what happens if you all of a sudden like feel into your body, where in your body that force of actually wanting to initiate, of actually being on top more, of actually switching the positions, of actually controlling the speed, all of these different things. And this is another way in monogamy to bring extra awareness. Now, if you're not in partnership, you can even explore this within yourself, right? Because that giving, that really kind of forceful, and I'm using these terms very, very loosely, but that energy that's more moving, right? That moving directive type of energy, that yang, that fire energy, that we would call it, even in self-play, right? What happens if you go faster and harder with yourself, right? Versus if you go softer and more gentle, that more receptive energy. So we can even play with the poles that way. I was interviewing somebody yesterday named Marlo Fiskin, who's a movement expert. I strongly recommend her work. And she was talking about an exercise she likes to do with partner play, where you just begin to actually move your hips together and to move your body and wiggle around together, not necessarily even sexually, but just to help you get more inside your body. And she said a fun way of partner playing it is almost like one person has a fake remote control and another person, say, is the person that's moving. So the person that's moving essentially maybe starts, you tell the person with the control, says to the other person, move their hips. And then if you have the remote control, you say, move your hips faster or slower, or reverse your angle, and now move your hips while you walk. And so these were exercises she was giving out. Again, strongly recommend her work, so go check that out. But the point of bringing that example in here is this is another way. In this example of, say, somebody is moving their hips and we have one person let's say that's basically saying, okay, well, move your hips faster, move your hips slower. We have the receiver, the person that's moving the hips, getting the information, and the person with the fake remote control, that person that is basically directing. So this is another way, even with like foreplay or just embodiment exercises, where we can have this person where it's like, oh, I'm going to control, I'm going to basically guide, I'm going to direct, I'm going to basically have that level of say power, so to speak, of saying like, okay, what have like directing, move your hips this way, moving your hips that way, and then receiving that direction, and then flip your roles. Right. And so you can do that, like I said, you can do that in partner play, you can do that in solo play. You don't have to be in a long-term monogamous relationship to obviously try this. You can do this with any lover or sexual partner. But really, the concept of this is these laws of attraction, these polarity kind of roots that have been studied and explored in some of these ancient medical texts for a long period of time, as far as how to embody these different forces within inside us. And you will find, it's like in a cis hetero type of scenario, like I said, most of the time women have a little bit more of a tendency to be a receiver, and men have a tendency to be more of that director, but not always, not always. And the concept here with these poles is that all of these forces, no matter what your orientation is, no matter what your gender is, anything, all of these forces actually exist within us. So these are human forces, right? And so what you want to really explore is, what are your natural tendencies in these poles with these human forces? And then how can you lean into these poles more deeply? And then how can you explore what it's like to be in the opposite pole? So if you're not that receiver, what does that look like? What does that feel like? Does it add novelty? Does it turn you on? And part of this, and part of what I'm doing throughout this podcast, really, especially in all relationships, but a lot of my work really is focused on females and on monogamous couples. And so a lot of the work I really do is really looking at, in these scenarios, how can we bring more of the hotness in? How can we bring more of the novelty in? How can we begin to understand our bodies and our body's needs? And how can we not isolate parts of our body? Because, the law of familiarity often talks about how we just go back to that thing we know, right? And this is where sex and even masturbation can become very monotonous, right? Where it's like, that thing, that position, if you do this position in this way for this speed and that amount of time, it works. Right? But novelty actually allows us to come back into our body and connect with our partner even more. Novelty allows for better hormones to be produced that are more balancing for our body, that allow us to come back to our partner over and over again. Novelty is going to allow for more dopamine to be released. Dopamine's that drive that's going to want us to come back more and more and more again. So we want to continue to find ways of exploring novelty. And in ourselves, we have all of these different forces, right? That's what I love about some of these ancient texts that I've studied from a medical perspective, is they're very holistic. So it's saying that, we do have these tendencies, we do have these archetypes, we do have the way that we are born into the world, and maybe we are more fiery, right? I'm a very fiery person. But there's also all of these elements within us, right? So, even in like conversations like introversion and extroversion, even for example, if somebody's an introvert, that doesn't mean that most introverts do very well in a complete socially isolated environment, right? It means that maybe they need more time to recover by themselves. Maybe they do need more alone time, but it's not at the exclusion. It's not saying that, okay, well, introverts should live in a cave, right? I don't know any introvert that would like that. So that, again, these forces are all inside of us. Same thing with extroverts. Every extrovert I know, I'm an extrovert, love people, get filled up by people. And sometimes I just need to be alone for a moment, right? So we have all of these different forces inside of us. And even though we have our tendencies, we have these various ways we show up in the world. And so that's what we're really looking like with this exercise sexually, is to say, hey, what's our tendency? How can we create more of that polarity? And how can we explore these opposite poles from time to time, even if we have our go-to, even if we like to receive more, even if we like to be the one that's more directive, more, whatever your pole is, that's beautiful, right? So it doesn't matter female, male, whatever your pole is, it's beautiful. So wherever you're at with that, still exploring, because we all have these tendencies to want to get into these kind of ruts, like I said, and the ability to actually explore these other parts of ourselves not only is so helpful for like long-term sexual satisfaction, but it also helps all of the different parts of ourselves actually get to explore, actually get to play. And really, I believe it really helps us not only be a more rounded lover, but it really helps us be a more rounded person, because the more we explore the different sides of ourselves, and the more the different sides of ourselves have a voice and a place in our world, the more that we are just living from a whole perspective. So I hope that's helped. Please leave any questions in the comments. I love talking about this. And always remember your concluding thoughts. Stay classy, stay sexy, stay a little badassy. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for listening to the Libido Lounge. Please don't keep me a secret. Please share this with your friends. You can find me on YouTube, on Instagram, as well as how to work with me at mylibidodoc.com.